right, good evening, welcome. My name is Erica Charis. I'm the Outreach Librarian here at the Stan Getz Library. Part of what I do here, since that job title is kind of mysterious, is I run the events programming for the library. So every Wednesday we're in here doing different lectures, film screenings, discussion panels. So if you have a great idea that you'd love to see us do, please let me know. I'm open to all kinds of suggestions. A few quick things to say before we get rolling. One is the papers on your chair. Those are bibliographies of information and listening around tonight's topic. So if you're interested in reading more, take that with you when you go. We are going to probably save questions to the end, and mostly that's because of the mic situation. So I realize in a room this size, me talking to microphone is kind of silly. But that is mostly for the cameras. We are recording this evening. Normally we would live stream, but that's not happening this evening. But for those who want to go back and watch this later, I want to make sure that they can hear your question as well as his answer. So when we get to Q&A, I'm probably going to shove a mic in your face, even though that's kind of silly for a room this size. If you haven't already found them, those snacks are all you. Make sure they disappear so I don't have to figure out what to do with them afterwards. Other than that, I'm just going to give a quick introduction for Wayne and then give him the floor. So Wayne Marshall's research and teaching focus on popular and dance music of the Americas and the world, Afro-diasporic cultural politics, musical publics, and media technologies. He teaches music history courses in the liberal arts department here at Berkeley and at the Harvard Extension School. A self-described technomusicologist, Wayne authors a blog, which is wayneandwax.com, as well as numerous articles and one genuine physical book, ta-da, which is on your bibliography there. So that's it for me. I'm going to hand the floor over to you and disappear until we're at Q&A time.
Thank you very much, Erica. Thank you, all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here in general at Berkeley, where I started teaching this spring, and it's a special pleasure to be here tonight to share some of the research that I've done over the last decade, a lot of which took shape in this book that I co-edited and to which I also contributed a long sort of chapter on the history of reggaeton, where, among other things, I try to sort out some of the claims to national origins and national pride, and also link those to musical aesthetics and so forth. And you might ask, and I want to start out by saying, how does a guy from Cambridge, Massachusetts end up being a reggaeton historian? And I'll tell you very briefly how that happened. I'm trained as an ethnomusicologist, and I consider myself an Americanist in the broadest sense, in that I'm interested in the interplay between North America, South America, and the Caribbean. And a lot of my work has focused especially on the interplay between the music of and in the United States and the music of Latin America and the Caribbean. I wrote a dissertation about Jamaican music and especially African American music, looking especially at hip hop and dance hall. And then a funny thing happened when I came back from Jamaica. I was teaching digital music workshops in Roxbury and Dorchester, where I'd go to a community center computer lab, install a bunch of versions of Fruity Loops, and get the kids making beats right away. Usually they wanted to make hip hop beats and reggae beats, dance hall reggae style beats. This was 2003, so this was sort of the era of Sean Paul, and a sort of a big moment for dance hall reggae, or for reggae more generally in terms of its circulation in American pop spheres. And so, I would sit down with them. This isn't Fruity Loops, this is Ableton Live, but just to give you a sense of what might happen, I'd sit down and I'd say, well, what kind of beat do you want to make? And they'd say reggae. And I'd say, okay, well, let me start you off with a real skeletal reggae beat, and then you can, play around with it, flesh it out. And so when one kid happened to say reggae, I sort of drew something like this, where you have kick drums and snare drums playing a very typical for reggae, and in fact for the Caribbean more generally, a very typical rhythm. Something like that, right? So if I just press play on it, and maybe you can give me a little more juice in the room? Thank you. So all it's really doing is, subdividing the measure in such a way that you get these nice groups of 3 and 2. So you get a little push-pull. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And anyway, this has been the prevailing beat in dancehall reggae for We're going on 25, almost 30 years now. Sometimes there's 2 kicks in a row. Sometimes there's 2 snares in a row, but that's the basic pattern. And I put that together for the kid, and he said, no, Spanish reggae. And I said, well, you can rap or sing in Spanish on that, and we can call it Spanish reggae. He said, no, Spanish reggae. And I said, I don't really know what you mean, I have to admit. And he's like, wait a minute. And he went home, and he actually went home and came back with this. He came back with the CD that was playing before we came in here, Tego Calderon's debut album, El Abayarde. And he played me some tracks on it, and it blew my mind in a lot of ways, but it also cued me into what he meant. He was talking about a stylistic distinction, which actually has a lot to do with the history of reggaeton and why it coalesces in the way that it does. I mean, what he wanted me to do was to preserve this rhythm structure, but actually to add a couple kicks. So let me just draw in a couple more kicks here on the downbeats. Right. And so that's what he was thinking. And for people who follow reggaeton, that's dembow, more or less. I mean, it's a skeletal version of dembow, and we'll talk about why it's called dembow in a minute. A more recognizable version, more filled out version would be this. And that's the beat that, in fact, as a sample, supports upwards of, I'd say, 75% of all reggaeton songs. And it's a story I'm going to get into tonight, but it's the kind of beat that you would find circulating on beat CDs like Pistas Famosas de Reggaeton 3. And it'll be labeled something like Dembo, original. And what it is, it's a loop. Ostensibly, when I started looking into it, well, right away it said to me sonically, oh, this is a dancehall reggae, a version of dancehall reggae that was very popular in the late 80s and early 90s, where you did have that pronounced 4-on-the-floor kick drum, but you still had the snares pulling against it in a way that I think now is a beat that people recognize as dancehall reggae. A lot of people, if you played them this and said, this is reggae, would probably say, what? That doesn't sound like Bob Marley at all. And part of this story is also hearing how dancehall reggae emerges from as it departs from what we think of more generally as reggae or as roots reggae. So let's get into that story, because you can start in a lot of places with the story of reggaeton, and we're going to touch on a lot of places. You probably would do well to start in Jamaica, since it's called reggaeton after all. Reggae has pride of place here, and there's a reason for that. And what I want to talk about is this moment in the mid to late 80s when dancehall reggae takes a very particular shape, and a shape that would ultimately prove very resonant across the Caribbean and more broadly in the world. So I want to start in 1985 with a song that caused a bit of a sort of revolution in Jamaican music. In lots of ways, it did build on, I think, what you know as reggae, but in other ways, it was a major departure. And so I'm thinking about the slang tang rhythm. This was a record that was released in 1985 by a guy named Wayne Smith called Under Me Slang Tang. And what made it so special is that it was the first rhythm. When I say rhythm, too, I'm using the sort of Jamaican parlance, which is to say the whole accompaniment, the whole arrangement, not just the rhythm aspects, but the bass line, the chords, all of that. This was the first accompanimental track in reggae that was built entirely on a little Casio, basically, with a preset drum track and using these sort of chintzy, timbres that, for whatever reason, sounded great through a sound system. And there are all these stories about the first time they took slang tang to a dance to play it and see how it worked with the audience. And that's a major part of this story, is this symbiosis between artists working in studios and then getting a chance to put their music into a feedback loop with audiences. And this song apparently played most of the night. They just kept running the same rhythm over and over again. Initially just with Wayne Smith's song, but before long, the producer who made the rhythm, King Jammies, had recorded dozens of artists over it. And that wasn't all that remarkable. This system where reggae musicians do different songs on the same versions or the same underlying track had been around since the late 60s, more or less. But this was the first time it was a digital track. And I want to play it for you so you can hear, hopefully, how it has some continuities with what you might know as reggae, but maybe you'll hear some departures as well. So you can hear those keyboard chords on the upbeat, So that's obviously something we often associate with reggae from the sort of classic era. Okay, so it's, if you can't understand Jamaican patois, I'd say it's an anti-drugs song. It's a pro-marijuana song, but it's anti-drugs. It's an anti-cocaine, and it was a party song. It's a sort of subgenre unto itself. And there's a few other things that we could talk about here, right? It's got a sort of dubby bass line with that repeated note. But otherwise, the drum track is very straightforward. It's very square in a way. There's not a lot of polyrhythm in it, and there's not a lot that you might immediately fasten onto as sort of in the realm of Afro-Caribbean aesthetics. But one of the really interesting things, again, to come back to this feedback loop, is that the way that these tracks would be activated in a live setting is very different than the way that they were recorded necessarily in the studio. They'd be recorded in a way that maybe would support that kind of a pliable approach. But let's take a listen and, in fact, give a look to what it would look like to take this rhythm and to use it as a support for a live performance. So we're going to go to 1986 and a concert put on by the Sturmar's sound system. Cuddy Ranks is the name of the MC, or in this case the DJ on the mic, and there's a selector behind him who's playing the track. And you'll see that the selector is basically, as far as how he's interacting with it, he's not cutting up records or anything like that. He's really basically using a volume slider to do all of the interaction with the track. And it happens to be a political rally, so there's some talk of politics and so forth. But I want to generally try to attend to the musical dimensions here and how that track is being massaged in the moment.
Me want the leadership when me and Michael Manley. A special request to all junglist posse. Me love me like me PMP. Me love me like Mr. Manley. Now, what up you want if you love Manley? Chocote rockin' in a category. Lord of East. I'm poor old selector.
Okay, so I don't know if you can follow what just happened there, but he did a whole routine where he ultimately said, push up your hand if you love Manly, which was his way of saying, put up your hand if you endorse the current candidate for prime minister. And he did it with a melody that's very recognizable. It had been made into a hit by Yellowman a few years before, and in fact had long been a sort of melody associated with political sloganing in Jamaica. Could you hear the slang tang underneath there? I don't know how much it comes through. It was very fragmentary because, in a sense, all that was being let through was the sound of the rhythm on those accents that I showed you when I opened up the talk. Womp, 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 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, pum, 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 pum. And so then he got a big response from the crowd, so he says, "Ease up, selector!" Like, stop it, stop the track, let's start over again. And that's what's happened, and we'll let the tape roll a little bit more, where we'll get to hear, I think, a version of the rhythm that at first is a little bit more non-manipulated. So I think you'll recognize it, and then we'll pay attention again to what the selector is doing to it, and in fact how he's coaxing these more, if you will, sort of Afro-Caribbean rhythms out of what's otherwise a fairly straightforward, rhythmically speaking, track.
So
there it is, starting up.
I know your rule to me, and them can't cross the border. Don't get us standing on black people, hear me now. Conkechi, insect lyric, conkechi, insect lyric, under the man, insect lyric, conkechi, insect lyric, phenomenon, insect lyric, conkechi, insect lyric, insect lyric, conkechi, insect lyrics. Them keeping a dance, say hand at the church. When they be in, say come and pay them money word. The sound we apply down the dirt type power. With a bad boy, watch us the gate master. And a thief in rock him have a cash register. And the boy in in your pocket, take out every dollar. Better watch that this snake him long a maga. There's a pink sweet wine, me say on the camera. Butterfly come down and dance with mosquito.
This guy right here is the one who's actually playing the rhythm at the moment.
Pink sweet wine, me say on the spider. Now them flip up scorpion, put him in a ball of fire. Then him shoot up himself with a bushmaster. Me say this hard run on jumping out Toyota. And he drive down the road, them take bacon. Me say watch new bunga so down in a tree.
And you note how much the rhythm is really being restricted. I'm sorry, it's this guy here. And you can see his finger on here very subtly playing those rhythms. Some variations. So anyway, that's just to say that these rhythms are thought of as expressive resources that can be activated, reactivated in all manner of ways, played with, manipulated, either in a studio session or in a dance or a concert like this. And I want to point out that when you listen to how he's manipulating it, a lot of it is taking it and turning it into this other kind of rhythm. And it's at this time that this other kind of rhythm starts to really assert itself in dancehall reggae. And in fact, picking up on this, on the sort of response that sort of rhythm gets, producers start to fold it into their own productions. So they start to play it with snares, they start to play it with drums. Instead of making a rhythm that can then be played with that way, they actually embed those rhythms into dancehall reggae rhythms. So if you listen to something like the Pokemon Jam rhythm recorded by Steely and Clevie a few years later, so now getting to about 1990 or so, you can hear those rhythms now sort of built into the track. And in fact, you can hear how those rhythms become such a sort of sign, a signifier of reggae, that you don't necessarily have to do the chink, 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 chink. You don't have to do the skanking chord on the offbeat anymore to be reggae. And that starts to shift reggae in a way that I would argue ultimately makes it, not that reggae wasn't resonant outside of Jamaica prior to that, but makes it resonant in a very different way for other audiences. So here's Pokemon Jam rhythm. And here, of course, we start to get this steady kick drum on each beat. But against that, you can hear the snares, right? So I can just to superimpose that for a second. Let me turn that one down a little bit. But you hear what I mean, right? Yeah? And there's some little dubby touches, some of the other stuff, some of the other sort of relics of reggae, if you will, still in there, still a part of the mix. But really what's being foregrounded is that rhythm. These kinds of tracks end up being really popular everywhere that reggae is popular. And that includes places like Panama, places like New York, places where a lot of Jamaicans have moved and have resettled. So then we get into this question of, when people start doing reggae in Espanol, when Spanish reggae starts to become a thing, and that seems to happen most prominently in Panama by the late 70s or so, but it's especially in the late 80s with the rise of this dancehall style, where Panamanians recording Spanish cover versions essentially of these reggae songs ends up becoming a kind of popular culture, not only in Panama and in cities like Colón and Panama City, but in New York City as well, where you have Panamanians living alongside Jamaicans and Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Dominicans and Hondurans, and you sort of have enough of a scene that in fact something could be put together in 1991 called Dancehall Reggae Espanol, and paying tribute to all of these recordings of popular reggae songs in Spanish, dancehall reggae songs in Spanish. And in fact, what they've done here is oftentimes they've paired up the translations on the same thing. So in fact, this record has two different versions, a Spanish and an English version of Little Lenny's Punani Tegareg. So we get Little Lenny's Punani Tegareg, and then we get El General's Putuntun, which is kind of, I think, a purposeful misspelling because the actual spelling of the track might have been seen as vulgar and not so easy to stock in a record store. But you know, tu pum pum or punani, these are variations on an Afro-diasporic word for part of the female anatomy. And Little Lenny is singing in praise of that, and he's also singing in praise of his own prowess. And it sounds like this. And you'll hear similar rhythms. So I'm going to let him go through the verse. When he comes back to the chorus, I'm going to segue right into the El General version, and you'll hear how close they are.
Ay mamacita porque soy un general digo que a la pa'lante digo jala pa' atrás tu pum pum digo se van a estirar digo todos los hombres lo van a corretear boom como una bruja lo tendrá que castigar tu pum pum mami mami no me van matar mami mami no me van matar.
Okay, so as you can hear, it's essentially the same rhythm. It's not actually the same exact recording. A new set of musicians have re-licked it. They've re-recorded it in their own way, and that's consistent with reggae practice. El General does his best to really do a close cover version, right? He kind of cleverly changes punani to pum pum mami mami, and he maintains the contour. And he seems to differ with Little Lenny on whether or not it will kill him dead, but they sort of mean the same thing. So it was a popular cover. It worked in clubs. It would get played right alongside the Jamaican versions. And El General made a name for himself. Now, the important thing to say about this, though, is that El General had made a name for himself in Panama. He had come up with a group called Franco y Su Cuatro Estrellas, which were one of the first groups to do reggae in Espanol. And he was one of the 4 stars, and then sort of had a burgeoning solo career before he moved to New York to join his mother and to study accounting. But he got roped back into the reggae business, and he started making records. And so that's the important thing, is that most of these records by Panamanians and by other people from Central and South America rapping in Spanish over reggae beats were made in New York City. So while Panama does have a very important claim to sort of taking dancehall reggae and exploring ways to do it in Spanish, it's also, I think, very important to note that this was happening in New York City, and it was Jamaican musicians working with generally Panamanian vocalists and managers to make cover versions that could actually be sold and cover a different market, sell reggae to Spanish listeners, Spanish language listeners. And so this was a practice, and the reason that we call this beat dembow is after a song by Shabba Ranks called Dembow, which was also covered in this same way and ended up, for whatever reason, becoming this kind of foundational sample to reggaeton. Now, the thing about Dembow is that it also requires for me, every time I was looking into this story and trying to find out, well, why is it Dembow? Why are they calling it Dembow? I mean, the obvious answer is because it's the rhythm from Shabba Ranks' Dembow, but actually when you listen to them side by side, it doesn't sound like that. So here's Shabba Ranks' Dembow.
Just back. How about see me half with you? Ain't no sunny Shabba in the line about cat to dirty. Nasty liberty. Dembow, 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 Dembow.
Okay, well, so we'll stop there for a second. But I mean, you can hear it's the same rhythmic structure. We still got that kick drum on every beat. We've got the snares pulling against it. I mean, it's a little bit looser. You know, they're channeling different sort of Jamaican live drumming traditions, even while they're producing this essentially digital rhythm. But if you compare that to the one that circulates as the Dembow, timbrally, they're really not the same. And this was a great puzzle to me because I could hear some kinship, and obviously people were using this term dembow and wanting to mark it as a sort of associated with this Shabba Ranks song. But I hadn't figured out, well, how did that happen? What's the missing link here? And it turns out the missing link, again, is a New York City-based collaboration between Jamaicans and Panamanians. In this case, a record that eventually goes out, actually recorded by two Jamaicans living in New York, Bobo General and Sleepy Wonder, called Pounder. And this was something I had gotten hints for at when I was sort of deep in Panamanian reggae chat rooms, trying to figure out the story here. And people would talk about the pounder rhythm. And I couldn't figure out what the pounder rhythm was, but it turns out that people in Panama refer to the dembow rhythm, the instrumental to the Shabba Ranks track, as the pounder because of this record. This record actually put out an instrumental version on it. But originally it was relicked in a studio on Long Island in order to sell it to New York area Spanish speakers. And they went with a guy named Nando Boom. Nando Boom, also a Dominican vocalist who had made a name for himself Panamanian vocalist who made a name for himself in Panama, released a whole album of Spanish reggae, again called Reggae Español. And these titles also bear witness to the fact that it was a novelty. This was seen as a new thing. I mean, it was remarkable enough that you would call your album that. So he went into the studio and they said, well, you got to cover this song Dembow. And he said, okay, and he listened to the song. It was a popular song, and he said, okay, I'll record a version of it. And so the musicians laid down their own track, a sort of emulation of the Shabba Ranks rhythm, and then Nando Boom recorded this song.
Benson, yes man. Levante la mano todas las chicas que tienen ambición. Que este año nos vamos lejos. Hey. Benson. Alza la mano, tiene su pensión. Salta y remonta, tiene su pensión. Gritan fuerte, tiene su pensión. Tienes una estufa y televisor. Sacan tu pecho como un cañón. Ya no comes sardina ni con colón. Todos los días comes pavo y jamón. Alza la mano si tienes ambición. Gritan fuerte, tienes ambición. Miren a Sonia, tiene su pensión. Miren a Beth si tiene su pensión. Miren a Mariela, tiene su pensión. Alza la mano, tiene su pensión. Pensión. Ella no trabaja si no hay pensión.
Okay, so you can hear it's very similar. He's saying pensión in the same way that Shabba says dembo. But he's talking about a pension, right? He's talking about if you're paid, basically, to put up your hand, all this kind of stuff, if you have a pension. And the Jamaicans in the studio, I mean, as the story was told to me by the manager, who I interviewed over MySpace about this many years ago, he said that, the Jamaicans said, well, what is he singing about? And they told him, and they said, no, that's not what Shabba Ranks is sung about. Shabba Ranks' Dembow song it's an anti-gay song, basically. And they said, that you've totally changed the message. You need to re-record it. You need to chant down these taboo, deviant sexual practices, these Babylonian imperialistic impositions of sexual libertinism. And so, I mean, I'm sort of putting it in hyperbolic terms, but in Jamaica, this is also a kind of subgenre of dancehall song, which is sort of, in a very complex way, yoking together a denunciation of homosexuality with a kind of anti-imperial stance. And we didn't listen to the whole Shabba Ranks song, but in addition to very colorful sort of metaphors for prohibited sex acts, right? So there's something already kind of funny about him using very lurid language to talk about things that you shouldn't be thinking about or doing. But in addition to that, he says, he's saying them bow, they bow. And by they bow, he's both referring to sort of physical, literal acts of bending over to commit acts of sodomy, and he's saying that they bow to foreign oppression, that this is an import from the West. And that's a position that's been constructed in certain kinds of religious discourse, but also anti-imperialist discourse. And he says, they bow. Freedom for black people come now. So he sort of, he makes it a very tricky kind of critique, at least if you're a reggae supporter and you consider yourself in the mainstream of at least Jamaican sort of public discourse. Nando Boom, being the sort of accommodating recording artist that he is, went back to the drawing board and recorded a new version called, later titled Ellos Venía. It literally means, again, they bend, they bow.
Bowcat? Yes, man. Voy a decirlo vulgarmente. Todos esos mamones que se echen para atrás y esas mamonas. Iris, dembow, 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 dembow. Hombre con esa falda que se zumbó. Alza la mano si no vende zumbo. Gritando fuerte, no vende zumbo. Hombre con esa falda que se zumbó. Gritando fuerte, no vende zumbo. Salta y rebota, no vende zumbo. Hombre que trabaja, voz de chica zumbo.
Okay, so and I mean, if you can understand Spanish, you might recognize that he's essentially, saying a lot of the same things that Shaba is saying, and in both cases, and this is an important context for it too, they're saying things like, push up your hand if you don't do that stuff that you're not supposed to do. So it's part of this feedback loop with audiences, and frankly, it's long been an easy way to get the audience on your side, because it's not a kind of issue where people are going to stick out their necks at a show about this. So, that's sort of part of how this is working as a kind of, in a way, coercive rhetorical act. It's also effective in lots of ways. And so he does that. It ends up being a relatively, big hit within this small scene, so much so that El General records his own version too. And I want to point to a couple things here, because in El General's version, not only does he, again, sort of hew to the Shabba Ranks original, but he also does this kind of Pan-African solidarity, gestures toward Pan-African solidarity bound up with that message too. So if we skip ahead to sort of the midpoint of El General song, we hear Easy Jamaica, Panama, Canada, Puerto Rico, Brooklyn, Colombia, all the girls. Yeah, all the girls. You always got to shout out all the girls. So again, I just want to point to, there's something I think necessarily discomforting about a sort of anti-gay anthem ending up serving as the foundation to a genre, but it's also bound up in a broader cultural politics, and in fact, as we'll hear, the associations or the connotations of that particular critique of sexual orientation go away pretty quickly, and instead it becomes a rhythm. So when people today say dembow, oh, I love dembow, that wouldn't make sense to a Jamaican, but people can say that in the context of Puerto Rico, and it does make sense because it refers to a rhythm, it refers to a feel. And as you might have noticed, the Nando Boom accompaniment sounds a lot more like the version that circulates as Dembow Original on Pistas Famosas de Reggaeton 3 and other discs like that. So on the other side of Pounder, as I noted, is this dub mix. So Dennis the Menace, the Jamaican musician who replayed this version, also released a dub mix of it, which, according to Pucho Bustamante, the producer of the record, he said that was a bad habit of the Jamaicans, putting the instrumentals on one side. I mean, he doesn't recognize that, in fact, it's not a bad habit. It's crucial to the way that reggae can get activated as a live social practice, not just a thing that you listen to at home, but something that you would play for people dancing and play in your own way. And so this is what the instrumental sounds like as recorded directly off of this record. Let me make sure I have yeah. It should sound pretty familiar. And all the elements are here. So when you hear the official dembow, for people who want to be sticklers about what dembow is as opposed to other loops and rhythms that have become popular building blocks in reggaeton, they're talking about this. And just timbrally speaking, if I play that next to this one, I hopefully you'll hear it. This one has been beefed up and remastered and all kinds of things, but I'll go back and forth, I'll toggle back and forth a bit, and I think you'll hear that timbrally, it's a dead giveaway that it's the same source. Okay, I'm back. right? So, in a sense, what has happened here, I mean, by the time we get to this track that ends up, you know, on this CD, it's been sampled and looped and you know, over and over and over again, and it's been circulating as a loop, not as a record. I think actually relatively few people have this record, but as a loop, it's utterly promiscuous. It really does circulate quite widely. And just to look at it a little bit more closely, I've arranged a version of it here. And essentially, it's the same kick and snare pattern we've been hearing the whole time. It's got a little bit of an extra percussion line and some other little sort of filigree there. And when I talked to Pucho Bustamante about it, he said, oh yeah, that was me saying we need more sabor. You know, we need to bring something that's Latin into it. I mean, you know, part of the argument here is that when Jamaicans started to bring those cross rhythms into the foreground in reggae, that was interpreted by a lot of people as sort of returning to a kind of Afro-Jamaican roots music. And the reason it's called Poco Manjam is because they're referring to Pocomania, which is an Afro-Jamaican sort of Creolized practice, religious practice that involves these drumming traditions. And so for me, part of what explains why these rhythms end up so resonant in places like Puerto Rico is that it also relates to roots music in Puerto Rico. For a lot of people, it also sounds like bomba and plena, and in fact, you know, even at a more basic level, these rhythms are some of the same rhythms that get played by the bass in salsa and in other places. So as opposed to roots reggae, which in its way is a little bit more modeled on the kind of United States, you know, duple meter, you know, more square kind of thing. I mean, there's plenty of polyrhythm worked in there too. But in terms of the rhythmic foreground, it's not surprising to me that this stuff would have resonated so much more across the Caribbean. And so before long, what happens is that these records being made in New York also are popular back home, you know, so to speak. And of course, you know, the definition of that depends on who you are and how much you go back and forth. In a place like San Juan, right, there's, you know, home and away between San Juan and New York. It can depend. But these records started to get played at parties in San Juan and other cities as well. And in the Puerto Rican scene, they didn't actually come into the reggae scene there. They came into the hip-hop scene. These were dancehall reggae records where guys were essentially rapping over beats that were recognized as beats. And a lot of these records themselves would get played at hip-hop parties in New York City. So also the guys who were devoted to hip-hop in Puerto Rico started to embrace them as well. And it wasn't just the dembow. And this is one of the interesting things, and in fact, a sort of distinguishing feature about the Puerto Rican approach to dancehall, in contrast to the Panamanian one, is that in Panama, there's a very faithful approach. As we heard, the cover versions are really close, you know, there's a fidelity there and maybe even a reverence. Whereas in Puerto Rico, in part because these guys were coming from a hip hop perspective, a sample-based chop it up and reassemble it perspective, they don't at all sort of honor the integrity of these rhythms. They'll put several of them on the same track, you know, playing at the same time or in alternation. And so you'll have something like the dembow, and you might have a loop of that going for 4 measures, 8 measures, and then you'll get to the fever pitch. And these little snippets of popular reggae rhythms end up becoming sort of building blocks for the Puerto Rican producers. Fever pitch and dembow being 2 of the most popular and commonplace. Right, or Sly and Robbie's Bam Bam rhythm. Especially this little sort of blippy section, but also the part with the guitar in it that many of you should recognize from Murder, She Wrote. Or Dirt's Man's Hut this year, especially for its bass line. But not just reggae sources. They'd also sample things like 900 Number by 45 King, or any number of other things. And in fact, when you listen to the stuff that's being made in Puerto Rico in the mid to late 90s, it's got an overwhelming number of samples in it. It's really densely layered and selecting from a sort of interesting grab bag of sources, mostly dancehall, mostly hip hop, a little bit of pop, some other sort of more local sources too. But in some sense, it rivals, some of these really dense sample-based works that are thought of as the kind of hallmark of hip hop's golden age of sampling. So even the stuff that the Bomb Squad were doing for Puerto Rico, for Public Enemy, or which say the Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique, or the work of Prince Paul for 3 Feet High and Rising, all of these really dense, deeply referential sample-based musics. This is a sort of analog to that, or an equivalent to that in the Puerto Rican context. And so let me play you an example of what that sounded like. So here is, so the other thing about this is initially these records were, they were tapes. They were produced in people's living rooms, and they were made as a short run of tapes. Tapes, compact cassettes are one of these amazing technologies that you could use to suddenly, be your own producer and distributor. You didn't necessarily need access to a studio if you could set one up at home, make tapes, make an initial run that could then be copied hand to hand, copied by, sort of black market stores and that sort of thing. And so initially, somebody like DJ Playero would make a mixtape. This is Playero 37. Which is sort of often thought of as the first really big underground, or which was a synonym for, before reggaeton was the term, one of the synonyms for it was underground. And obviously that's an English term. It's coming from New York, and you see a reference to sort of New York and generally sort of hip hop style here. You see, of course, the sewer grate, stuff coming up from the underground, both an aesthetic underground and a sort of, referring to the economic margins that this music is being made on too. Graffiti-esque font, let's say, and then interestingly enough, figures that are, obviously referring to Keith Haring's work, sort of New York artist who was on the edges of the graffiti scene, you see also on things like Playero 38. So very telling iconography. Here we have a guy in dreadlocks with a visor on that says reggae mix. He's wearing an African pendant, right? So in some sense also, this is very much picking up on the sort of Afrocentric cultural politics that was happening in a lot of contemporary hip hop at the time. And we get a spray can, we got other references to sort of hip hop culture mixed up with reggae culture. And in terms of mixed up with, I also want to note that there's a funny kind of translation going on here too, and you can see that even in the spellings of things, right? So this, the first track is called Nonstop Rigi, and the second one's called Raga with 2 A's, mix to mix. They're making their own thing out of this reggae in a way that, say, the Panamanians were not. And you can really hear it. So let's listen to, say, the opening of DJ Playero's 37, which is actually it's opened by Daddy Yankee. So for those of you who are familiar with Daddy Yankee, probably through Gasolina, you're going to hear a much earlier version of him rapping here, and quite a virtuosic version, actually. He goes extraordinarily fast, and that was a thing that had become a prized feature of dancehall reggae, and you can hear that, in fact, in the intro. He's very much emulating a Jamaican DJ with his rapid fire and, in fact, English and patois lyrics. And then he gets into Spanish, where he sort of kicks it into Puerto Rican overdrive in terms of the speed of things. But listen also to the shifting accompanimental beats underneath.
Boy got to run now, because I got the lyrical bomb. Strictly ragamuffin nacha. Lot of mercy, hear me now. Come again now. Donde mi nom no vengas, si quieres de mi perdona ahora. Y dice, donde mi nom no vengas, si quieres de mi perdona ahora. Y dice, donde mi nom no vengas, si quieres de mi perdona ahora. Y dice, donde mi nom no vengas, si quieres de mi perdona ahora. Y toda la gente me entiende cuando yo le canto al milloso. No le doy la.
So there's that bass line from Hot This Year, or drum song. It's actually the drum song rhythm. and a reference to the lambada, because anything is fair game. Okay, and you know, in this case, you know, that kind of intertextuality, you know, deep multiple allusions to all kinds of other texts is really part and parcel here, and it's something that's you would find that in a reggae song as well. I have another example from this era that I want to play. So there were two sort of main production houses making this proto-reggaeton. One is Playero and his series of mixtapes, and the other is a collective known as The Noise, who also had a nightclub by that name. And I want to look at their video for The Noise 6, so it's also a numbered set of mixtapes. Well, the interesting thing about this video is that it's shot in New York City. So again, I just want to, I don't want to, you know, Manhattan keeps on taking it, famously as the song goes, but there is an important place for New York City in this, and part of that has to do with the cultural imagination of Puerto Ricans and how this music, you know, sort of interfaces with that. So the other thing about this track, which is a bit more typical of this era, is that you really do hear the fast shifting beats, a lot of different samples coming in and out, and we also get to hear an early Ivy Queen or Evie Queen if you're familiar with some of her work. One thing I'll point out, just in terms of the rap style, you hear that very fast double time triplet kind of style, which is you know, audibly a reference to Jamaican forms of rapping, which were also becoming very influential in New York-based hip hop, especially at the same time. So here's The Noise 6, including a lot of important New York landmarks. So yeah, we get turnstiles, we get the Unisphere in Queens, Met Stadium, Central Park, snowball fights. We're not in Puerto Rico. And here we get more of a hip hop beat, but then we're back to that dembow style rhythm. Gotta like the cop standing by while that happens. We got another sort of iconic reggae sample coming in now, the horns from the Stalag rhythm. And then another striking change in musical texture. So then we get much more of a straightforward New York hip hop, boom bap. And then we're back to the dembow again. And that kind of alternation, that kind of, just sort of resonant sample after resonant sample, sometimes layered right on top of each other, again, was really par for the course here. And you see them bringing together all these different signifiers from Jamaican culture, from New York hip-hop culture, from Puerto Rican culture, putting them together in a really distinctive and powerful way. And notably, they really are rapping in more of a Jamaican style here. And again, you can hear that with the sort of rapid-fire triplet sort of thing. And notably, when Evie Queen comes in, she says, "Reggae respect, Ivy Queen." And she's referring to what she does as reggae right here, not as reggaeton, not as rap, not as hip hop, but reggae. And so, for my student 15 years ago or 10 plus years ago to say Spanish reggae, that's because that's really what people were calling it still. They thought of it as reggae. The idea of reggaeton as a new way to describe it and to market it comes a little bit later, and that's sort of the next chapter of things here. So one of the things that happens is that reggaeton, or the Spanish style reggae, does first through swelling kind of grassroots support and circulation gets more and more popular in Puerto Rico, in New York City, and elsewhere in the diaspora. Reggae radio stations in Puerto Rico start playing it. It's especially popular with the rise of CDs and CDRs and the ability to produce your own and circulate your own productions. And it also starts to get a little bit more industry support, and so access to different kinds of resources, especially promotional ones. And the sound starts to change in some ways too. And so around the time when they start calling it reggaeton now, we're talking about 2004 or so, the premier producers at that point are these guys known as Looney Tunes, who themselves embody the story of reggaeton in a very interesting way. Both of them born in the Dominican Republic, lived for a short time in Puerto Rico, and then moved to Peabody, Massachusetts, right? And found themselves in this broader sort of Puerto Rican Dominican diaspora where reggaeton really was the soundtrack for themselves and their peers. And while they were working actually at Harvard Dining Services, they were also making beats and increasingly communicating with some of the producers down in Puerto Rico, and eventually found themselves working with some of the premier names down there, and eventually became the premier producers. And so if you want to hear sort of reggaeton as it's sort of being called that, circa 2003 or so, this track, produced by Looney Tunes, Hectoritito, Yo Te Buscaba, I Was Kissing You, is a fairly quintessential example of it. I think you'll hear those same reggae rhythms that we've been hearing, that same dembo rhythm, but otherwise the accompaniment is all synthesized now. It's being produced on digital audio workstations like Fruity Loops. In fact, Looney Tunes did use Fruity Loops, and so what we hear instead are, far fewer samples. It's a lot of synthesized strings and synths and other things like that. Notably, though, the samples that remain are the drums, and especially the snare drums. And if you listen to a lot of Looney Tunes productions, you can hear a very subtle but regular switching of the snare drum samples, which, to me, represents a kind of continuity with that mixtape practice of that shifting beat that we heard just a moment ago. But here, let's get the sound of reggaeton circa 2004 into our ears. So we're going to go back down to 95 beats per minute, and this is Hectoritito.
Hectoritito, Looney Tunes y Noriega van a seguir abusando los cocorotes. Toma.
Yo te buscaba, no te encontraba y quería más de ti. Tú me mirabas enloquecida y tú querías más de mí. Yo te buscaba, no te encontraba y quería más de ti. Tú me mirabas enloquecida y querías más de mí.
Looney Tunes y Noriega, los cocorotes.
Estás tentando más tremenda, está rozándome. Estás alocándote y tu cuerpo provocándome. Vamos maniática, arrebátame pegándote. Cuerpo con cuerpo calentando y azotándote. Cambio mirada con mirada, estás fronteándome. Pero un instinto de sicaria porque
And you can hear how up front in the mix the snares are too. Really a lot of presence.
Si tú me quitas, yo te doy candela. Yo no soy soltero, no me
And there ends up being more attention to sort of pop song form here, right? And also some fusions with other kinds of pop and R&B styles, and in a sense a little bit more polish. And this is where the producers really are trying to make a sort of more viable lane for what they're doing, not just circulating in some kind of informal economy, but having record labels that have distribution deals with the majors and all of that. And this is sort of the beginnings of that moment. The real big turning point for reggaeton in terms of its sort of escape from Puerto Rico or getting crossing over to new audiences is probably in 2004, though, with Nori's Oye Me Canto. And so, tellingly, it took a New York-based hip-hop artist, Noriega, aka Nori, to take the genre and give it its first hit. And in fact, as far as I can tell, its biggest hit. Well, we can argue about that. It actually did go higher than Daddy Yankee on certain charts. The Gasolina may have outsold it, but it was also in lots of ways the first reggaeton hit that a lot of people heard if you weren't already in that world. I remember hearing it on 94.5 and being really struck, because you don't hear Spanish on the radio here in Boston. It's not like New York. You can't find Spanish on FM almost at all. And suddenly you could hear verses entirely in Spanish, choruses in Spanish. I mean, occasionally a block of songs in Spanish. And so it seemed like a very interesting moment. Of course, in terms of the press, it was also hailed as a sort of a sign of the demographic changes happening in the United States and the increased numbers of Spanish speakers and all of that. And this is also, of course, a marketing angle that Nori sought to play up. And being the first one to do a collaboration in this way was a big part of it. And as you see from the video, they really do make a lot of effort to wave the flag, so to speak. Let me skip ahead to, yeah. So, Oye Me Canto is a Nori song, but it also features, in this case, Daddy Yankee, another rapper, and Nina Sky, a duo from New York. And it begins with them dancing in a Puerto Rican box, really a giant box with the Puerto Rican flag on all the walls, and then the walls sort of fall away, and we find ourselves on a beach full of bikini-clad women waving the flags of Latin America. And then we're back to Daddy Yankee. And we can sort of stop there. There's a nice picture of the United Nations of Reggaeton there. Some interesting inclusions and exclusions here, right? We get the Brazilian flag. It's not a Spanish-speaking country. We get, it tends to be more closely related to the sort of Caribbean basin and so forth. But, generally the marketing here is, it takes cues from the tourist industry, right? And more generally is marketing reggaeton as a sexy dance music, complete with very sort of, let's say, naked objectification of women. And there's a lot of, I think, fairly obvious maybe we don't have to call it pandering, but attempts to reach out, right? So the chorus itself has built in this litany of names, not unlike what we heard from Shaba Ranks too, but they say Boricua, Morena, so Puerto Rican, black, Dominicana, Colombiana, and they add Cubana, they add Mexicana. Even though reggaeton's not really big in Mexico, it has its pockets of popularity. But and in fact, there's a really telling moment in a documentary called The Chosen Few, where it shows Boy Wonder, a Dominican producer who produced this track, in the studio with Nina Sky, coaching them to say, okay, now say Mexicana, now say Cubana, now, Colombiana. And he's sort of, making sure that they hit all the bases. And so this is very important because in a way, it not only marks reggaeton's first appearance in the pop sphere. And, as I said, I think it makes it up to 12 on the Billboard Hot 100. It makes incursions into the rap and R&B charts as well. But it also puts forward reggaeton not as Puerto Rican, necessarily. I mean, there's a big Puerto Rican box, don't get me wrong, and Boricua is the first name in the litany. But the other thing that I didn't talk too much about in Puerto Rico is that in its gestational moments, reggaeton in Puerto Rico, or proto-reggaeton, was often framed as música negra. So it was more about a sort of black identity in Puerto Rico in lots of ways. And when we get here, we've gone sort of from música negra to reggaeton latino. So there's this way in which reggaeton is being marketed more broadly as Latin music than as, say, black music. And I think that's kind of telling. Around the same time, we also get Don Omar's Reggaeton Latino, which does a similar thing and tries to bring together that constellation by using all kinds of iconic images of Latin American politicians and athletes and so forth. And we can just take a quick look at that. But you can also hear there's a sort of manifest destiny in his chorus here. Can you feel the power of Reggaeton Latino?
The chosen few.
And again, we've got that classic dembo beat at this point, but then you'll watch that it actually does shift toward more of a hip-hop feel for the verses. So in that way, also sort of, in some ways, referring back to these other styles that we heard. But yeah, I mean, it's really putting forward a different image of reggaeton, and it did so fairly successfully, at least, in this moment, which we might think of as a kind of heyday for reggaeton. I mean, it does continue to enjoy a lot of popularity in a lot of places, but as far as its sort of moment in the mainstream, this was it, and it coincided with a lot of efforts to sort of promote urban radio, right, Hispanic urban radio, a lot of radio stations switched to a reggaeton format, and then more of a sort of música urbana format, and reggaeton was a major force in sort of changing ideas about what urban Spanish music could sound like. There are also musical references that have to do with this kind of, if you will, the sort of Latinization of reggaeton. And part of that has to do with guys like Looney Tunes being Dominican, wanting to bring a little bit of merengue or some bachata or occasionally some salsa into what they're doing. So this is a very telling example. If we listen to Wisin and Yandel's Dembo from 2004, on the one hand, we'd hear obvious echoes, right, and references to the Shaba Ranks track that gave this rhythm its name. But we don't get any references to sexuality except to the kind of sexuality where men and women dance with each other at the club. On top of that, though, what we hear, to my ears anyway, are very obvious references to bachata. So an attempt to fuse reggaeton with bachata for this particular remix.
Vamos allá, Boricua. Vamos allá, Nueva York. Vamos allá, los latinos. Looney Tunes. Esa nena cuando baila me vuelve loco bailando el dembow. Dembow, dembow, dembow. Me vuelve loco bailando el dembow. Esa nena cuando
anyway, you kind of get the idea, right? Esa nena cuando baila me vuelve loco bailando dembow. So that girl, when she dances, she drives me crazy dancing dembow. Dembow, dembow, dembow. She drives me crazy dancing dembow. If you said that to a Jamaican, they'd say, what the heck are you talking about? What do you mean she's dancing dembow? Those things there's no syntax there. But it means something totally different by this point. It means the rhythm, it means the act of going out dancing. And the other thing to note here is, in terms of the cultural politics, listen to how they begin, the opening address, how they address the audience.
Vamos allá, Boricua.
Boricua,
Vamos allá, Nueva York.
Nueva York,
Vamos allá, los
Latinos. Right. So Boricua, New Yorkers, Latinos, right? It's like that classic New Yorker cartoon, sort of, right? When you see sort of the horizon in front of you. A very careful address too, and one that's also, I think, discernibly different from some of the earlier litanies of affiliation that we saw. There's other ways that I could talk about, that sort of process of localization, indigenization, nationalization, Latinization, things like Tegos Dominicana from this album I started out with, riffing on an old El Gran Combo tune. So just very quickly, I'll show you how that works. So here's El Gran Combo's Ojos Chinos. So, very distinctive piano line. Classic salsa, El Gran Combo, one of Puerto Rico's real premier salsa bands. All right, so you get the idea. Here's Tego's version.
Oye, es Tego Calde, con sandunga, pero boriqueña. Hey.
Oye, mi negrita linda tiene chiquititos los ojitos. Si me tiro una guiñada, se va conmigo pa' Puerto Rico. Ay, que me llevo entre un compas en el alma. El día está pa' bellaquearle bajo una palma.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? And this was part of a broader trend toward infusing what was originally something really composed of dancehall reggae references and hip-hop references into something that could be more broadly capacious, and especially taking in various kinds of Latin dance genres. Now, the other sort of important way of looking at sort of, if you will, reggaeton's moment in the pop heyday is to say that arguably I think what by one measure is the best-selling song of the 21st century so far is a reggaeton song. It features, in fact, the dembow beat, the same sample that we've listened to all this time. I don't know how many people would have recognized it as such, but I think you'll probably hear it now that we've listened to a few of these things, and it's this.
Ladies up in here tonight. No fighting.
We got the refugees
No
up
fighting.
here.
No fighting. Shakira, Shakira. Never really knew that she could dance like this. She make a man wanna speak Spanish. Como se llama? Bonita. Shakira, Shakira.
Oh, baby, when you talk like that, you make a woman go mad.
You hear the dembow under there, though? Obvious.
Reading the signs of my body. I'm on tonight, you know my hips don't lie, and I'm starting to feel it's right. All the attraction, the tension. Don't you see, baby, this is perfection.
Okay, and of course, Shakira's own marketing is very consistent with reggaeton's marketing as sexy dance music. And for Wyclef Jean's part, he does a pretty skillful job here, giving her basically a dance pop single that not only refers to reggaeton, but also to classic salsa romantica. Okay. And so, again, bringing lots of things into that mix there, but in lots of ways that was very consistent with reggaeton's new aesthetic of a kind of, a Latin dance music that also had this very strong pumping reggae club beat, essentially. So, by some measures, reggaeton generated the biggest hit of the 21st century so far. For others, it has, by others, it has so-called, run out of gasolina. I don't really subscribe to that view myself. I mean, you don't hear it in the same channels that you used to hear it, but it remains a popular resource for artists across the world, really. And there's probably no better place to look at that than the Dominican Republic. So over the last few years, there's been a real revival of not just reggaeton, but of dembow in the Dominican Republic, where the genre, in fact, is known as dembow, dembow dominicano, or just dembow. And what it is, guys like DJ Escoff, making remixes and new tracks that, like the old playero stuff, are really based on a dense layering of fragments, resonant fragments, oftentimes some of the very same ones that we heard before. So here's one example. You hear the little fever pitch underneath there. And then we hear the bass line from Hot This Year once again. And you see it's pretty relentless, it's just one thing after another, and a lot of these classic beats, some of the same loops that I played just a little while ago, get recycled over and over and over again, chopped up and made into new things. And it's to the point where it's become even a sort of, it's entered into the pop sphere in Dominican Republic as well. So guys like Omega, who emerged more, out of the merengue scene, the kind of merengue de la calle scene, record songs like Lo que tiene el dembow. But for my part, actually, one of the most exciting things about Dominican dembow is the sort of culture of grassroots street dance built around it. So, I mean, you can find tons of videos out there, like this one, showing virtuosic dance partners or dance teams just having a lot of fun to this music, and in part the way that it moves. And of course, in the dance moves too, you see a really wonderful fusion of, in some ways more traditional Dominican dances, things that also look maybe like, that looks more like jerkin, the reject. It's quite a fusion of dance styles, quite a melange, in the same way the music is. So that's, for me, if you want to find sort of the heartbeat of reggaeton right now, the Dominican Republic is one really good place to look. Another quick example that I'll offer is in Colombia, where it has started a whole craze known as choque, which means collision, and there's a certain style of dancing that goes along with that, where you collide with your partner once every beat. But also it has now entered into a whole genre known as salsa choque, where the salsa groups have been influenced by that. But just to give you a glimpse of choque. So it's kind of like the Puerto Rican perreo, except there's in some ways less contact, in some ways more. And these guys are having fun on a rooftop in, I think, Buenaventura. And obviously there's a lot of fun here. They also sort of, the tables get turned at certain points and the girls get to smash the guys. And so there are just lots of ways in which, you know, if you don't look at the pop charts, if you look at other measures of, you know, sort of vibrant culture, living culture, you do find reggaeton still animating a lot of young people dancing together, which is how it started and which is really what it'll always be. And taking different local shapes depending on where it goes. I kind of want, oh, there she goes. Now we turn the tables. So I think I should probably stop there. I mean, I could talk about reggaeton in Romania or Egypt or lots of other places where it's gone, believe it or not. But I think I've hopefully offered a pretty good overview of all the places it's come from, all the places it's gone, the different shapes it's taken over time. And, you know, for my part, I'm going to continue listening and especially, you know, keep my ears on those snares because that seems to be one way in which a certain embodied tradition of all this referentiality and especially of that Afro-Caribbean aesthetic maintains a real strong presence in the music. So thanks for listening along with me.
We do have time for questions, and like I said earlier, it's kind of silly to have a mic in this room, especially with a group this size, but we're recording, and I want to make sure that your questions get recorded as well as the answers, so I'm going to run around with the microphone, but does anybody have a question or comment or something they want him to repeat? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rada. I'm from the Dominican Republic, and I can relate like a lot with everything you said because that's basically my childhood. It was a lot of it. But what I wanted to ask you is, where do you think? I know you said that there's a lot of a dembow movement in the Dominican Republic, but where do you think reggaeton is going musically and because I know that there's that movement in the Dominican Republic, but I'm not seeing like the fire it was before when Daddy Yankee was with Gasoline and everything. It was like Anteo Calderon, all those guys. It was really huge.
Right.
Where do you think all that went, and do you think like it will be still going creatively with producers and stuff?
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm no prognosticator, but you know, I think I can answer or try to answer some of the questions about where it went because it was kind of striking to me. I mean, it was such a prominent moment for the music, such that even guys like Tego, who started out more in the hip hop scene, crossed over to reggaeton in part to grow his audience and to take part in that whole thing. And reggaeton became this very effective label for marketing yourself, even if you initially saw yourself more as a rapper or what might be. But I think part of it is that it was so embraced by the industry that there was almost a saturation, you know, and I think people got very tired quickly of a certain amount of sameness. And, you know, it doesn't mean that that's exactly the reason. I mean, the other funny thing is that with that saturation, I started to notice certain groups wanting to distance themselves from the label, you know. So even if they made music that you could still hear in some ways as in the reggaeton tradition, if you're talking about, say, Evie Queen or Calle 13 or Tego Calderon, they also started to branch out, or they wanted to be known as música urbana artists or that sort of thing instead, just as a kind of pure reaction to the label and whether the label was hot or not. And at a certain point, the label became not so hot, which is maybe one reason why they don't call it reggaeton in Dominican Republic anymore either. But yeah, I mean, I think there are a few other ways to talk about where it's going. I mean, on the one hand, if by reggaeton you mean, you know, and people might not call it that anymore, but you mean this kind of Afro-Caribbean oriented dance music that's also very sort of conversant with modern pop, a lot of music coming out of Puerto Rico will continue to sound that way. And Dominican Republic too, with guys like Omega and other people who are already sort of in industrial lanes might find ways to bring that into what they're doing. You know, on the other hand, and this was something I was trying to get at too, there's a way in which, you know, reggaeton also might be seen to be going in directions that aren't so purely focused on commercial industry. So when you look at, I mean, obviously somebody like DJ Scuff has a career based around DJing, which he promotes with his mixes that he puts out there. But then there's this whole other, if you will, this whole other kind of industry that has to do with people making these beats in fairly modest circumstances, recording videos of themselves dancing to it, and then putting it up on places like YouTube. And that in itself being this whole, in some ways, very fulfilling sphere of circulation, especially for young people who aren't necessarily trying to be you know, recording artists or, you know, that sort of thing. So I kind of see two ways in which reggaeton continues, maybe not by that name, but as far as, you know, saying whether it will have another mainstream moment, and by mainstream I mean in a place like an Anglo, you know, English-speaking country like the United States. I mean, to me it seemed like that what we saw in the middle of the last decade was, well, I wanted to imagine that it wasn't just another so-called Latin boom, you know, because you can see these moments over the course of the 20th century where some kind of dance music from Latin America suddenly becomes a craze for white and black Americans, and you know, through, you know, you can trace that from tango at the beginning of the century up through crazes having to do with, you know, rumba or mambo, and all manner of other things, and all the way up into sort of the Ricky Martin moment and that kind of thing. But they're sort of these boom and bust things. And I wanted to believe actually that reggaeton wasn't about another boom, but that it was going to be a more sustained wave now that we are a sort of more integrated country and more of a multilingual country, or even bilingual country. But that wasn't the case, you know, for whatever reason. And yet, you know, that demographic change is still happening. That force is still a force. So I feel like it's probably a matter of time before at least those cycles get more close together. You know, all genres sort of have their rise and fall. Some can be sustained much longer. I mean, dancehall reggae has been around for, you know, now 30 years. People have been using that term dancehall. I mean, hip hop has been around for 40. They've changed a lot over time, but interestingly enough, those labels have stuck. And so why reggaeton has not, and why, you know, people might want to distance themselves from it now, is interesting in comparison to those things. On the other hand, I think you might note that that drum beat, which initially, you know, you could say, well, it was the Jamaican crossover records like Sean Paul and so forth that sort of brought that back into mainstream club music, but it has become really commonplace now. And for the last 5-10 years, you find a lot more dance pop, just using a sort of very broad term for it, that uses those rhythms. And I think reggaeton deserves some credit for that, for just putting it back more out there in the realm of club music. So there's some other ways where maybe we can hear those legacies, even if we don't hear Spanish rapping.
Anybody else? I have something to throw in the mix, actually. Just thinking back to the video with all the flags. And I'm curious, because I don't know a whole lot about it, is it odd to have that sort of pan-Latino identity, and chicken and the egg sort of thing? Like, is reggaeton a driver of that idea, or was that happening and they just kind of jumped on the bus?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, I think the artists responsible for producing that video and producing that song were being very savvy about an emerging Spanish language market in the United States that was diverse in terms of nationality, where people were coming from. They might have also been a little bit hopeful that it was going to, say, catch on huge with Mexicans. Because it didn't exactly. And in fact, in a lot of those countries, you know, that are represented by the flag, reggaeton has a devoted audience, but but sometimes it can be sort of marginal. I mean, Weezy and Yandel can sell out stadiums in Mexico in the same way they can sell out Madison Square Garden. But you know, also reggaeton can be fairly stigmatized in places like Mexico for one reason or another. So I mean, you can definitely go across Latin America and find an audience for it. So in some ways, it does. There's something real there about those flags, but in other ways, I think it was, as I say, a sort of savvy, ambitious attempt to really sell to a pan-Latin audience, whereas previously it really was for a relatively small audience of Puerto Ricans and people living in New York who spoke Spanish and happened to be into this kind of stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's an artist called Calle 13. They're very into pan.
Yes.
Calle 13 is an artist that they want to make money, but they do get a feeling that there's a lot of message about Hispanic unity.
That there's a politics to it. Yeah.
Very political component.
Mm-hmm.
It sells. It can help sell, but
right.
It seems quite legitimate at many levels. Not saying it's.
Yeah,
I
mean,
not up to.
Some people exploit that more cynically than others. I mean, I think you can look at the Don Omar video and say, really, you know, some of these political figures, what he's singing is, you know, dance, women, you know, shake it, get low. I mean, it's not, feel the power of reggaeton Latino, but there's a real kind of sleight of hand going on there, I think. Whereas, yeah, Tego Calderon, Calle 13, I mean, they're sort of activists in their own right, and they get quite thorny, you know, with their politics. You know, Tego especially in terms of racial politics, and Calle 13, you know, all manner of ways, you know, having to do with, you know, local politics in Puerto Rico, but also more of this Bolivarian, you know, pan-Latin identity stuff as well.
That jogs another question for me, because I've always thought, and again, like I'm not a Spanish speaker, so when I listen to it, like the lyrics aren't actually registering, but I'd always thought of it as a very like sexually driven lyric from what I understood, but you brought in a lot of the political. So was it more political at one point than another, or are they all just all in there all the time?
It's really mixed up, you know, and Jamaican music is like this too, and sometimes it might be, you know, song to song, like there'll be, oh, this is a gal tune, or no, this is a weed tune, or no, this is a politics tune, this is a reality tune. Or as we saw with the Shabba Ranks thing, you might in one verse be talking about sex, whether it's sex you like or you don't like, and then in the next verse you might be talking about identity issues, you know, and whether that's racial or national or that sort of thing. So, I mean, I would say, and I don't know that reggaeton is necessarily exceptional in this regard as a pop dance club music, but yeah, there's a lot of emphasis on sex. And that's true both in the music, in the lyrics, and it's true in the marketing especially, right? A lot of scantily clad women on the covers of CDs or in the videos, or, you know, in the clubs, you know. But the other side of that, you know, which was interesting when we were writing this book, because, you know, there's the obvious both interface with and tension with hip hop, and yet there's a funny thing that reggaeton in its way offered a platform for men and women to get together and dance and at least have some kind of exchange. Now, people will talk, you know, some people have different opinions about the nature of that exchange and who's in power and who's not and who's objectified and who's not. But a lot of women who participate in the scene as dancers and in other ways argue that it actually creates a space where they're put in the center and where they do have the power in a certain way, even if that's the power that comes with being an object of the gaze or, you know, or what it might be. And when you compare it to a lot of hip-hop scenes, tend to be more homosocial in that, you know, it's a bunch of guys in a circle, you know, rapping and doing, you know, sort of competitive acts of virtuosity, whereas reggaeton is not so much about that. There's obviously plenty of competition and virtuosity and that sort of thing, but it's also focused on being an actual functional intergender dance music, and it has actually succeeded in that way. not that hip hop hasn't, but it's sometimes a very interesting contrast if you look at, say, the scenes in San Juan, and then I think, you know, it causes us to ask different questions about the gender politics and what's going on there. And of course, I mean, I'm not one to speak for somebody else. I generally would like to hear, you know, from women about their participation in it and how it feels to them. Yeah.
Anybody else? All right, I guess we'll call it at that. Keep your eye on Wayne as a course instructor, because, wow, I learned so much this evening. But thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. And make sure you grab one of those sheets as you're headed out. And like I said, clear out those snacks so I don't have to throw them away.
Yeah, and I will. I'll put in. I'll put another plug for my website. I've been writing about reggaeton for many years now. So if you go to the sidebar and you click on reggaeton, you'll find a ton of things that I've written about it. As you can probably tell, I'm also very involved with sound, and so I've also created a number of mixes and other sort of sound-based works that tell stories about reggaeton. So there's a mix here on my sound page that's called Dembo Legacies, which strings together all these songs that use the dembo rhythm, and then Dembo Dem, which is all these versions of dembo. I played a number of them for you tonight. But you know, if you want to explore more, feel free to find me there. Drop me a line. Thanks.
Thank you.
And check this out.